There's a particular kind of exhaustion that only happens at work. It is that tiredness that comes from managing people or a specific person, like when you're bracing before you even walk into a room, or when you're replaying conversation, driving back home and wondering if you imagined it maybe, from smiling through something that made your stomach drop. That kind of tired is relational. And today I want to talk about what is actually happening when a coworker is making your life miserable. What the psychology tells us about different types of difficult colleagues, what situations they tend to create, and how to respond well, and how to make clear decisions when you're genuinely stuck about what to do next. So let's start with something that often gets skipped. The word toxic gets used so freely now that it has lost its precision. Someone who is annoying is not toxic. Someone who challenges you is not toxic. Someone whose personality clashes with yours also is not toxic. Toxicity in a relationship, it's a pattern of behavior that is consistently harmful for your psychological safety, functioning. Not all difficult coworkers need the same response. Not all difficult coworkers are actually a problem that you need to solve. So let's talk about the types. The first type is the chronic complainer. This is the person who is perpetually dissatisfied, who sees everything through a lens of unfairness, who pulls you into their narrative about how terrible things are. And they're not usually trying to harm you. What they're doing is seeking emotional co-regulation through venting. They need a witness for their frustration. And if you are empathetic by nature, you will become that witness. A specific situation with this type looks like this. You are eating lunch and they sit down, and within 2 minutes, they're telling you everything wrong with the department, the manager, the new policy. You did not ask. You've heard it before, but you also don't want it to be rude. So you listen, you nod while eating, you offer small validation, and 20 minutes later, you return to your desk feeling heavy and less motivated than before you sat down. That is emotional contagion. Your nervous system absorbed their dysregulation. The best strategy here is what I would call structured warmth. You do not have to be cold. You do not have to pretend that conversation is not happening, but you can limit the depth and the duration. A response like, "That sounds really frustrating, but I have to get back in 5 minutes, but I hope this afternoon gets better," is warm, it is honest, it is complete. You're not solving their emotional state. You're not their therapist. You can care about someone without carrying them. The second type is credit thief. This person presents your ideas as their own, disappears when work is hard, and reappears when it's been recognized. The specific situation here often looks like this. You share an idea in one-on-one with a colleague before a meeting. 20 minutes later, in front of leadership, they present that idea as theirs. You sit there feeling a cocktail of disbelief, humiliation, and not knowing whether to say something or let it pass. The wound is real, but the mechanism is deniable, which means if you react too fast or too emotionally, you can end up looking reactive rather than wronged. The best strategy is to create visibility before the meeting, not after. When you have an idea worth sharing, put it in writing first. An email, a message, a document, even something as simple as, "Here's what I am planning to bring up tomorrow." And it creates a timestamp. It also signals to the other person that the idea is traceable. You're not accusing anyone, you're simply making your intellectual contributions visible. After the fact, in a private conversation, you can say clearly and calmly, "I noticed you brought up the X idea today. That is something I shared with you yesterday. And going forward, I would like us to be clear about attribution." Short, factual, no drama, hopefully. The third type is the manipulator. This person uses information strategically. They form alliances and then weaponize them. And they present themselves warmly in some contexts and differently behind closed doors. The specific situation here looks like this. You confide something to this colleague, maybe a frustration with some project, maybe a personal detail, and later you discover that information was used in a conversation you were not part of, in a way that made you look bad or unstable or disloyal, Or you notice that they speak to leadership with warmth and charm, and they speak about colleagues with a sharpness that never shows up publicly. You feel confused after interactions with them. You start doubting whether you imagined it or whether it was real. The best strategy is radical information hygiene. You do not share what you would not want shared. You treat them professionally and pleasantly, but you do not treat them as a confidant, because you're matching your openness to the demonstrated trustworthiness of the relationship. And also document, document, document. When something happens that feels off, a conversation you were told about, a comment, you write it down with a date and a description. Well, you probably won't do anything with it immediately, but patterns become visible over time, especially when they're recorded. And your own perception slays clearer when you are not relying on memory, but you have some proof. The fourth type is the person with power over you who misuses it. The supervisor who humiliates you in front of others. The manager who gives you critical feedback only in public and positive feedback never. The team lead who assigns blame asymmetrically and takes credit structurally. Specific situation where looks like this. The manager views your work in a team meeting and uses a tone that is not simply direct, it's contemptuous. You can feel the difference in your body. Your face gets hot. You dissociate slightly. Later, colleagues don't mention it, which makes you wonder if you misread it, but you didn't. Contempt has a texture, and your nervous system recognized it before your mind even finished processing it. The best strategy here is different from the others because the power differential changes your options. Direct confrontation with someone who holds power over you carries real risk that you have the right to assess, of course, that you must assess. What you can do is also document every incident, and you can begin to build lateral support by strengthening relationships with other colleagues and mentors who can serve as witnesses to your competence and your character. You can explore what resources exist in your organization, HR, an ombudsperson, union, before you need them. So you understand what protection actually exists there. And in some situations, a carefully worded private conversation with the manager is appropriate when you say, I want to understand the feedback from today's meeting because I want to make sure I'm receiving it the right way. This creates an opening, and also it creates a record that you engaged professionally. Now, before we talk about how to actually respond to any of this, I want to address something that is not optional in this situation. It is the prerequisite to everything else. That is your emotional state at the time you decide to act. Here's what we know from both neuroscience and clinical practice. When you are in a state of acute emotional activation, when you're flooded, when your brain is being override by threats, you're not in a position to make good decisions. You're not in a position to write a good email or have a productive conversation because you are in survival mode. And survival mode is not best for strategic communication. This matters a lot in workplace conflict because the most common mistake people make is responding while activated. Like when you send an email at 11 at night, after replaying the interaction for 4 hours. And you can say something in a meeting right after being humiliated because the adrenaline is still moving through you, or you make a decision to confront or leave from a place of pain. And those responses, even when they are emotionally justified, often do not serve your actual interests. So the first practice is delay. When something happens at work that activates you, you give yourself a window before you respond. I learned it in the United States. When an email makes me feel annoyed, I take 24 hours. The research on emotion regulation shows that the acute physiological response to a stressor peaks and then begins to subside within roughly 20 minutes if you're not continuing to re-simulate it by ruminating. And that means if you can interrupt the rumination loop through movement, breath, brief grounding exercise, you can return to a more regulated state faster. Once you are regulated, you think more clearly and you can write better emails or choose better words. And then you can assess risk more accurately. Regulation is about having access to your full intelligence when you decide how to respond to something that made you very emotional. And then once you are regulated and you are still genuinely stuck, unsure whether to speak up or stay quiet or let it go, there's another tool I want to tell you about. And it comes from motivational interviewing, and it is called the Decisional Balance Worksheet. The concept is kind of straightforward, but this practice is clarifying, especially when you are in an ambivalence loop, when part of you wants to confront the situation and part of you wants to protect yourself by not making waves, and both parts feel equally reasonable. So the worksheet is a 4-quadrant structure. You draw 2 columns and 2 rows. The columns are labeled change and stay the same. The rows are labeled benefits and costs. So you end up with 4 cells. The benefits of changing, meaning taking action, having the conversation, escalating, or leaving. The costs of changing, the benefits of staying the same, meaning keeping the peace, not risking the relationship, not disrupting the environment, and the costs of staying the same. Most people, when they are in conflict avoidance, are only living in 1 quadrant. They are only seeing the costs of acting. This worksheet forces you to populate all 4. And what almost always happens when you do this is that the costs of staying the same become visible in a way they were not before. The chronic low-grade stress, the shrinking of yourself, the growing resentment, the slow erosion of your sense of dignity at work. Those costs are real and they accumulate, but they're easy to minimize when you're only focused on the immediate risk of speaking up. Here's how you would actually use it in a situation with a difficult colleague. Let's say you have been tolerating a pattern of public dismissal from a coworker for several months. You're trying to decide whether to say something directly to them. You sit down with a worksheet and you actually write in each cell benefits of saying something. I establish that my contributions have value. I stop absorbing the cost alone. I create a chance for the dynamic to shift. I respect myself enough to name what is happening. Costs of saying something. They may deny it. The relationship may become more tense. I may be seen as difficult. It may not change anything. Benefits of saying nothing. I avoid conflict. I don't risk the relationship. I stay under the radar. Costs of saying nothing. I continue to feel minimized. My resentment builds and eventually shows up in ways I can't control. I model to myself that my experience doesn't matter. I become someone who tolerates things I don't actually find acceptable. When you see all 4 cells populated, you're making a real decision, not a reactive decision. Decision based on the full picture of what each path actually costs and actually offers you. That is the kind of decision that you can stand behind regardless of how the conversation goes, because you made it from clarity. You made it from your values. And in workplace conflict, especially the longer one, that is the thing that most protects your integrity. Not the outcome of any single conversation, but the quality of the agency you bring to it. So try to do that. Let me know how it worked and if it helped you to make the right decision. And we'll talk more about difficult situations and difficult conversations at work. Take care.